It's 4:17 in the afternoon, and the house is exactly as quiet as it was at 4:16. Nothing changed. Nobody left. You didn't just say goodbye to anyone. And yet, somewhere between the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of your own breathing, you feel it, that particular kind of alone that has nothing to do with how many people love you. You've had this feeling before. Maybe at your kitchen table, maybe in bed at midnight, maybe holding a phone that isn't going to ring. Here's what almost nobody tells you before you get older. Loneliness doesn't wait for the days when you're actually by yourself. It has its own schedule, and it doesn't ask your permission. But here's a question worth sitting with, one we'll come back to before this video ends. Why do the wisest, most emotionally whole elderly people talk about loneliness less than almost anyone else, while understanding it more deeply than everyone? In the next few minutes, you're going to hear 8 things that wise elders have come to understand about loneliness. Truths that take most people decades to learn, if they learn them at all. Not comfort talk. Not the kind of advice that tells you to just get out more. Real distinctions between the ache that means something is wrong and the ache that simply means you're human. If you've ever felt lonely in a room full of people, or wondered why the quiet found you when nothing bad even happened, this is for you. Let's start with the difference almost everyone gets wrong. Reason number 1 is something almost nobody teaches you, and it's cost a lot of people decades of unnecessary suffering. Solitude and loneliness are not the same word wearing different clothes. They can feel almost identical in the body, the quiet, the stillness, the absence of another voice, but they come from 2 completely different places, and confusing them is where so much unnecessary pain begins. Think about the last time you sat alone on a porch, coffee going cold, and felt something close to peace. Now think about the last time you sat in a room full of family, laughter bouncing off the walls, and still felt like you were watching your own life through glass. Same solitude, in one case not even present. Wildly different feelings. Solitude is a door you chose to close. It has your hand on the handle. It's the space you built on purpose, and inside it you're still connected to yourself. Still whole, still your own company, just quiet. Loneliness is a door that closed without your permission. It's the ache of being unseen, unheard, unreached. Whether you're sitting by yourself or surrounded by people who love you but don't quite know how to reach the part of you that's hurting. Here's what wise elders come to understand, usually the hard way. You cannot fix loneliness by simply removing solitude. If you fill every quiet hour with noise, television, phone calls, errands, anything to avoid the silence, you're not solving the ache, you're just outrunning it. And it waits. It's patient. It will be there the moment the noise stops. The real skill, the one that takes most of a lifetime to learn, is learning to tell the 2 apart in real time. Asking yourself, in that heavy, quiet moment, is this peace, or is this the ache? Because the answer changes what you actually need. Sometimes what looks like loneliness is just your nervous system finally getting permission to rest. Sometimes what looks like restlessness is loneliness in disguise, begging you to reach out to someone, and you keep mistaking it for needing a project instead. That's not confusion on your part. That's a distinction nobody ever handed you the language for. Part of why this confusion runs so deep for your generation is that so many of you were raised to treat any admission of loneliness as weakness, something you kept to yourself and pushed through with a stiff upper lip. Nobody sat you down and explained that craving a quiet Sunday morning is completely different from aching for someone to talk to. So the 2 feelings got bundled together into one vague discomfort, and the instinct became the same for both. Push it down, stay busy, don't make a fuss. But a feeling you refuse to name doesn't go away. It just gets louder in places you don't expect. In your shoulders, in your sleep, in a short temper you can't quite explain. And once you can name it, once you know in your body which one you're feeling, something shifts. You stop punishing yourself for enjoying an evening alone. You stop assuming every quiet room means something is wrong with your life. But naming it is only step 1. Because there's a second truth almost nobody expects, one about exactly when loneliness tends to arrive, and it's very rarely when you think. Reason number 2. When do you think loneliness actually hits hardest? If you guess the years right after losing a spouse or the first Christmas alone, you're not wrong. But you're missing the years that catch almost everyone off guard, the ones nobody warns you about because they don't look dramatic enough to mention. It's not always the day of the funeral. It's not always the empty chair at the holiday table, though that's real too. Often, The loneliest stretch of a person's life is quieter than that. It's the years right after retirement, when the calls from coworkers slow down and then stop. It's the years after the kids finish raising their own kids and stop needing daily advice. It's a Tuesday afternoon, 18 months into a new routine, when you realize the calendar has gone soft around the edges, and nobody's really expecting you anywhere. Psychologically, this makes sense once you look at it closely. Grief has rituals. Cards arrive. People check on you at least for a while. But the slow erosion of a full calendar has no ritual at all. There's no card for "your world got quieter" without any single dramatic loss. There's no one checking in because from the outside nothing happened. You're not in crisis. You're just less surrounded than you used to be. One missed call, one skipped visit, one canceled plan at a time, until the silence becomes the norm rather than the exception. Wise elders learn to expect this phase instead of being blindsided by it. They understand that connection isn't something you build once, in your 30s or 40s, and then coast on for the rest of your life. It requires refueling. If you don't keep actively investing in it, reaching out first, showing up even when it's inconvenient, making the call instead of waiting for one, the natural gravity of life will quietly thin your circle down to almost nothing, and it won't announce itself as it happens. That's not a personal failure. That's simply what happens to any relationship that stops being tended. Think about how differently we treat a broken bone and a slow leak. A broken bone gets attention immediately, a cast, sympathy, follow-up visits. A slow leak just quietly drains the tire over weeks, and by the time you notice, you assume the tire was always a little flat, not that something changed gradually and nobody flagged it. Loneliness in the years after retirement or after the kids grow up works exactly like the slow leak. There's no single moment to point to, no single loss to grieve, which is precisely why so many people in that stage feel confused and even a little ashamed of the ache. They keep thinking, nothing bad happened, so why does this hurt? Without realizing that the absence of a dramatic event doesn't make the loss any less real. Recognizing this timing changes everything about how you prepare for it. Instead of waiting for loneliness to arrive and reacting in shock, the wisest among us start building smaller, deliberate points of contact years before they think they'll need them. A standing coffee with a neighbor, a weekly call with a sibling, a class or a group that meets on the same day every week. Something the calendar can hold on to even after the bigger structures of work and parenting fall away. Because by the time you notice the silence, you're already deep inside it. So if the quiet years are coming for almost everyone eventually, what do you actually do about the ones already happening to you right now? That's where it gets personal. Stay with me here, because the next two reasons are the ones that quietly reshape how you see every lonely evening you've ever had. Picture this. It's 9 at night, the house is still, and instead of sitting with the quiet, you reach for the remote or the phone, or you find one more thing that needs doing in the kitchen. Nothing wrong happened. You just couldn't stand being alone with your own thoughts for one more minute. Reason number 3 is about that exact instinct, the reflex to escape loneliness instead of listening to it. Most people, at almost any age, treat loneliness like a fire alarm. Something to shut off as fast as possible. Noise, scrolling, constant activity, anything to keep the ache from having room to speak. And it works for a while. The alarm goes quiet, but it isn't solved. It's just muted, and muted things have a way of getting louder later. What wise elders eventually discover, sometimes after years of trying every distraction available, is that loneliness isn't only a problem to be solved. Sometimes it's a message to be read. Sitting with it, instead of immediately fleeing it, is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't tried it. But underneath that discomfort is usually information. A hint about what you actually miss, who you actually miss, what part of your life has gone quiet that you haven't admitted out loud yet. This isn't about romanticizing suffering or pretending the ache feels good. It doesn't. But there's a difference between pain you run from forever and pain you finally turn to face, just for a few minutes, long enough to hear what it's trying to tell you. People who've lived a long time and come out the other side gentler, not more bitter, tend to be the ones who stopped sprinting from that feeling somewhere along the way. They let it sit at the table. They didn't set a place for it every night, but they stopped pretending it wasn't in the room. That's not weakness. That's the only real way loneliness ever actually loosens its grip. Think about it like a knock at the door late at night. You can pretend you didn't hear it, turn the television up louder, go to bed early, and the knocking might stop for a while. But it tends to come back, usually at a worse hour, usually a little louder than before. Answering the door doesn't mean inviting the feeling to move in permanently. It just means finally looking at who's there instead of living your whole evening around avoiding the sound. And here's the part that surprises people the most. The moment you stop frantically trying to outrun the ache, it often becomes smaller, not bigger. Not because it disappeared, but because you finally stopped feeding it your fear. There's one more layer to this, though, the layer almost nobody talks about because it involves the people we've lost, not just the quiet we're avoiding. Reason number 4 is the hardest one on this list, and it's also the one most wise elders would tell you changed how they understood loneliness forever. The loneliness that comes after losing someone isn't a problem waiting for a solution. It's a relationship that's still going on, just in a different shape than before. If you've buried a spouse, a close friend, a sibling who knew you since childhood, you already know this in your bones, even if nobody's ever said it to you plainly. The world tends to treat that kind of loneliness like a wound that should close on a schedule, 6 months, a year. You should be through the worst of it by now. But that's not how it works, and pretending otherwise only adds shame on top of grief. A cruelty nobody deserves. What actually happens, for people who've lived long enough to know, is that the loneliness of missing someone doesn't vanish. It changes texture. In the beginning, it's sharp, constant, impossible to set down for even a moment. Later, it becomes something you carry more like a stone in your pocket. Always there, sometimes forgotten for hours, then suddenly heavy again at the smell of a certain coffee, a song on the radio, an empty side of the bed that never quite stopped being theirs. Wise elders learn not to treat that stone as something to get rid of. They learn to let it be part of them instead of a problem to solve. The goal was never to stop missing the person. The goal was to build a life around the missing. One that still has room for laughter and mornings and new people, without ever requiring you to love the person you lost any less. That's not failing to move on. That's what loving someone for real actually costs, and continues to cost, for as long as you remember them. Notice how it's rarely the big anniversaries that undo you the hardest. You brace for those, you plan around them, you know they're coming. It's the small, unguarded moments. Reaching for 2 coffee cups out of habit, hearing their laugh in a stranger's voice, a favorite show coming back on the air, and there being nobody to call about it. Those are the moments that catch you completely off guard, precisely because you weren't expecting to need to be brave at 10 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. If you felt guilty for still grieving years later, or ashamed that a random Tuesday can undo you out of nowhere, that guilt was never yours to carry. Nobody hands you a manual for how long love is supposed to ache after it changes shape. If you're still with me, I want you to know this next part is where things start to turn, because there's a very different and honestly kinder way of thinking about who actually keeps you company as you get older, and it has almost nothing to do with how many people are around you. So no, the ache of missing someone never fully leaves, but it stops being your enemy. It becomes, strangely, one more form of love. And once you stop fighting it, you finally have room to ask a much bigger question. Does loneliness actually get better with more people in your life, or is that assumption wrong from the start? If you're still here, this next part matters even more than what we've already covered, because it overturns something almost everyone assumes about loneliness, something so common it's rarely even questioned. Reason number 5. How many people would you say truly know what's actually going on inside you? Not your schedule, not your health updates, but the real, unfiltered truth of how you're doing? Take a second. Is it 5? Is it 1? For a lot of people, even people who seem surrounded, the honest number is smaller than they'd ever admit out loud. Most of society measures loneliness by head count. More friends, more family nearby, more invitations on the calendar. Less lonely. It seems logical, the kind of math a well-meaning relative might do out loud. You should get out more. You should join a club. You should call your cousins more often. It's also, according to nearly everyone who's lived long enough to test the theory, mostly wrong. Wise elders learn that loneliness has almost nothing to do with how many people surround you and everything to do with how many of them actually see you. You can be surrounded at every holiday, invited to every gathering, technically never alone, and still feel a loneliness so deep it aches in your chest, because none of those people know what actually keeps you up at night. None of them know what you're afraid of, what you regret, what you're proud of but never say out loud. A room full of acquaintances cannot do what one true witness can do. This is why some of the wisest, most emotionally settled elderly people you'll ever meet have surprisingly small circles. Not because they failed to build a bigger life, but because somewhere along the way, they learned to stop chasing quantity and start protecting depth. One friend who calls just to ask how you're really doing, and actually waits for the honest answer, is worth more than 50 people who ask, "How are you?" as a formality on their way somewhere else. That's not settling for less. That's finally understanding what connection was supposed to feel like all along. If you think back over your whole life, the moments that actually eased your loneliness were almost never the crowded ones. They were the specific conversations, a friend who sat with you after a hard diagnosis and didn't try to fix it, a sibling who called on the exact day you needed to hear a familiar voice, a spouse who simply stayed in the room while you cried without needing you to explain why. Nobody remembers the party with 40 people the way they remember the one person who truly showed up. And once you understand that, the whole question changes. It's no longer, how do I meet more people so I'm not so alone? It becomes, who, in my life right now, actually gets to see the real version of me? And how do I nurture exactly that, instead of spreading myself thin trying to be liked by everyone? Because that shift, small as it sounds, is the difference between a full calendar and a full heart. And it leads directly into something that catches almost everyone off guard as the years go on. The world around you gets quieter, whether you want it to or not. Picture the phone. Not ringing. Not because anyone's upset with you. Not because you did anything wrong. It's just quieter than it used to be. The invitations that used to come weekly now come every few months. The friends from work retired somewhere else or passed, or simply drifted the way people drift when there's no shared daily reason to stay close. Reason number 6 is one of the gentlest and, at the same time, one of the hardest truths wise elders come to accept. Your social world naturally shrinks as you age, and it is almost never a verdict on your worth. It's math, not judgment. Careers end, so the daily proximity that built those friendships ends with them. Neighborhoods change. Health limits travel. People you loved pass on, and there's no replacing 30 years of shared history with someone new, no matter how kind the new person is. The mistake most people make, the one that turns a natural shrinking into a private wound, is interpreting the quiet as personal rejection. They start to believe something is wrong with them specifically, that they became less interesting, less lovable, less worth calling. And once that belief takes root, it becomes a quiet self-fulfilling prophecy. You stop reaching out because you're convinced no one wants to hear from you, and the silence you feared ends up growing precisely because you helped build it. That belief, more than the actual quiet itself, is what does the real damage. Wise elders learn to separate the two. They recognize the shrinking as a normal, almost mathematical consequence of a long life, not evidence of failure. And instead of waiting passively for the phone to ring like it used to, they take on a role most people never expect to have to play at this stage of life. Becoming the initiator again the way they might have been decades earlier when building new relationships felt normal instead of vulnerable. That means being the one who calls first. Joining the class, the group, the walk, even when it feels awkward to be the new person again. It means understanding that new closeness is still possible, but it has to be built on purpose now, the way it once happened almost by accident when everyone lived closer together and life did the work for you. That's not a sign you're falling behind. That's simply what it takes to keep a life full of people once life stops handing them to you for free. It can feel strange, even embarrassing, to introduce yourself to a stranger in a hobby class at 75, the way you might have at a college mixer decades ago. But the elders who end up with warm, connected later years are almost always the ones who let themselves feel that awkwardness anyway, rather than deciding it was too late or too undignified to try building something new. Dignity was never about staying home and waiting. It was always about showing up, even a little clumsily. And still, even with all of that effort, even in a life that looks completely full from the outside, there's a kind of loneliness that can slip in anyway in the quietest hours, for reasons that have nothing to do with how well loved you actually are. Stay close, because what comes next might be the most freeing thing anyone ever tells you about feeling lonely. There's an old line that captures this better than anything a script could explain. Loneliness is the poverty of self. Solitude is the richness of self. Wrote the poet May Sarton. Sit with that for a second because it quietly holds everything we've walked through so far. You are not lonely because you failed at life. You are not lonely because you became unlovable or too old or forgotten by the people who matter. You are lonely sometimes simply because you're human, and being human means the ache for connection never fully disappears. It just changes shape as the years go on, the way a river changes shape without ever stopping being a river. What separates a bitter old age from a peaceful one was never the absence of that ache. It's the relationship you slowly build with it, the same relationship the wisest people you've ever met spent a lifetime learning. Reason number 7 is the truth that confuses people the most, because on the surface it doesn't seem to make sense. You can be deeply, genuinely loved, surrounded by a life you're grateful for, and still feel lonely in specific, predictable hours. And that doesn't mean anything is broken. There's a particular kind of loneliness that shows up at 3 in the morning, or in the first 10 minutes after waking, or in the strange quiet right after everyone leaves following a wonderful holiday dinner. It has nothing to do with whether your life is full. It shows up in the gaps, the transitions, the moments when nothing is actively distracting you from the fact that some part of you is still, and always will be, a little bit alone in your own experience because nobody else lives inside your head, feels exactly what you feel, remembers your life exactly the way you remember it. Younger people often panic when they feel this, especially if their life looks good on paper. They think, I have people who love me. Why do I feel this way? Something must be wrong with me or my relationships. Wise elders learn something gentler. That a certain amount of existential aloneness is simply the price of being a specific individual person, and it shows up even inside good marriages, even inside close families, even inside genuinely happy lives. This doesn't mean you stop trying to connect. It means you stop treating every lonely hour as proof that your life or your relationships have failed. Some nights are just quiet. Some mornings just ache a little before the day fills back in. That's not a verdict on your marriage of 50 years, or how much your children love you, or how good your life actually is. That's not a crack in a good life. That's simply what it feels like to be a person inside one. Think of the people you've admired most for how steadily they carried their years, the ones who seemed somehow at peace with themselves. Chances are they weren't people who never felt that 3 a.m. ache. They were people who stopped being surprised by it. They learned to greet it almost like weather rolling through, nod at it, maybe put the kettle on, and trust that it would pass the way it always had before, without needing to interrogate their whole life over it. Understanding this takes an enormous weight off. You stop auditing your relationships every time a lonely feeling shows up, and instead you learn to let the feeling pass through, the way weather passes through, without needing it to mean something is fundamentally wrong. Which brings us to the very last thing wise elders come to know, the one that changes more than any of the others because it's not really about other people at all. Reason number 8, the last one, is also the deepest. After a long enough life, who is the one person you have spent every single day with without exception, from your very first memory to this exact moment? The answer is you. Not your spouse, however long the marriage. Not your children, however close. Not your oldest friend. You are the only relationship that has been present for every version of your life. The confident years and the frightened ones, the proud moments and the ones you'd rather forget, every joy and every 3 in the morning ache we just talked about. And yet, for most of a lifetime, that particular relationship gets almost no attention at all. Here is what the wisest elderly people eventually discover, often later than they wish they had. The deepest, most reliable antidote to loneliness was never finding one more person to fill the space. It was finally becoming good company for yourself. Not in a resigned, giving-up way, but in the way you'd want a true friend to be, patient with your mistakes, honest about your patterns, kind about your fears, and genuinely interested in how you're actually doing. Most people spend decades running from that relationship. They fill silence with noise specifically to avoid sitting alone with themselves, because self-examination can be uncomfortable, even frightening, especially if there's guilt or old wounds sitting quietly underneath. But the people who finally turn toward themselves instead of away, who learn to sit in a quiet room and feel, if not joy, at least a kind of peaceful okayness, those are the people who stop being afraid of an empty afternoon. Because an empty afternoon, to them, isn't empty anymore. It's just them keeping themselves company, the way a good friend would. That's not loneliness. That's the one relationship that was always going to outlast every other one, finally getting the attention it deserved. You can hear it in the way certain elderly people talk to themselves without a hint of self-pity, Well, let's see what today brings, said out loud in an empty kitchen. Not because anyone's listening, but because it doesn't feel empty to say it. That small habit, easy to overlook, is often the clearest sign of someone who made peace with their own company decades ago. It didn't happen overnight. It happened one quiet afternoon at a time, chosen instead of feared. And once you have that, once you're no longer afraid of your own company, everything else on this list gets easier to carry. The quiet hours, the shrinking circle, the ache for the ones you've lost. None of it disappears. But none of it has to define you either, not anymore. So let's go back to where we started, to that question about why the wisest, most emotionally whole elderly people seem to talk about loneliness the least, while understanding it more deeply than almost anyone else. Now you know the answer. It's not that they don't feel it. It's that they stopped being afraid of it. They learned to tell solitude from loneliness, to expect the quiet years instead of being blindsided by them, to sit with the ache instead of sprinting from it, to carry grief as love instead of a wound to hide, to choose depth over head count, to become the one who reaches out first, to let a lonely hour pass through without it being proof of failure, and, maybe most of all, to finally become good company for themselves. That's not a life without loneliness. Nobody gets that. It's a life that stopped being frightened of it. If any part of this found you tonight, if some sentence landed a little too close to something you've been carrying quietly, please hear this clearly. None of what you feel means your life went wrong. It means you lived long enough and loved deeply enough to feel the full weight of being human. You don't have to sit with it alone. There are people in this community, right here in the comments, who understand exactly what you're feeling because they've lived it too. If this video kept you company for the last little while, consider staying a bit longer. Subscribe, not because a channel needs another number, but because there's more of this waiting for you whenever the quiet finds you again. You are not as alone in this as it sometimes feels.